The ship appeared without warning. One moment the sky above Earth was empty, full of clouds and birds in the quiet hum of satellites. The next moment, something was there, something so large that it blocked out the sun over half of Europe. People on the streets of Paris, Berlin, and Warsaw looked up and saw a shadow where the sky used to be. Children pointed, cars stopped, phones came out, and then every screen on the planet, every television, every phone, every billboard, she had every laptop, flickered and went dark for exactly 3 seconds before a single face appeared on all of them at once. The face was not human. It had pale gray skin, 3 narrow eyes arranged in a triangle, and a mouth that barely moved when it spoke. But the words that came out were perfect. English, perfect. Mandarin, perfect. Arabic, perfect. In every language on Earth at the same time, in every home, in every country, all at once. People of Earth, the voice said. It was calm. It was cold. It carried the tone of someone who had done this many times before and found it boring. My name is High Arbiter Velkarath. I speak on behalf of the Galactic Council, a union of 17 civilizations that governs this region of space. You are receiving this message because your world has come to our attention. After careful observation and review, the Council has determined that Earth must be brought under proper governance. The message continued for 11 minutes. By the time it was over, every government on the planet had been given the same set of demands. Earth was to surrender 40% of its natural resources, minerals, water, biological samples, and rare metals on a schedule that would begin within 30 days. Earth was to immediately shut down all military programs, disband all armed forces, and hand over all weapons technology for destruction. One Earth was to accept a council-appointed governor who would oversee the planet's population and resources on behalf of the Galactic Council, and all of this was to be agreed upon and confirmed within 90 days. If Earth did not comply, the message said, the Council would begin pacification procedures. Belarath did not explain what pacification procedures were. He did not need to. The ship hanging over Europe was explanation enough. The message ended. The screens went back to normal, and for a moment, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. Then it exhaled and the world exploded into noise. News channels erupted. Social media collapsed under the weight of billions of posts. Governments called emergency sessions. People flooded into the streets, some screaming, some crying, some standing very still and staring at the sky with expressions that were hard to read. Religious leaders spoke, scientists spoke, politicians spoke. Everyone had something to say, and none of it amounted to anything useful because no one had any idea what to do. High Arbiter Velkarath watched all of this from his flagship. He stood in his observation chamber, a wide circular room with a transparent floor that looked directly down at the blue and white planet below, and he watched the chaos with his 3 narrow eyes and felt nothing. This was always how it went. Young species always panicked. They always argued. They always wept. And then, after a few days of useless noise, they always came to the same conclusion. There was no choice. The Council was too powerful. The Council had done this before. The Council would do it again. He had overseen 14 planetary submissions in his career. Earth would be the 15th. He expected it to be the easiest. Humans were soft Creatures emotional divided, prone to conflict among themselves. The councils. Analysts had studied Earth for decades and rated it as a Class 3 primitive. World, a barely spacefaring no. Alliances, no real weapons capable of threatening a council warship. The analysts had given the submission process a 97.4% chance of completion without incident. Velkarath was not even slightly worried. What he did not know, what none of the council's analysts knew because they had been watching the wrong things, was that the silence that followed the first 3 days of noise was not the silence of defeat, it was the silence of decision, as deep beneath the Swiss Alps in a bunker that did not appear on any public map. 41 people sat around long table made of plain gray metal. They were the heads of Earth's unified Defense Command, a body that had been quietly formed 11 years earlier when the first alien signals had been decoded, and it became clear that humanity was not alone and that not all of its neighbors were friendly. These 41 people represented every major nation on the planet. They had spent 11 years preparing for a moment that most of the world did not know was coming. Admiral Yara Oe sat at the head of the table. She was a small woman with short gray hair and dark brown eyes that had a habit of staying very still when she was thinking hard. She had been the head of Earth's Unified Defense Command for 6 years. She was not panicking. She was reading a report. 17 civilizations, she said, setting the report down. Collectively, they have approximately 4,000 warships within range of Earth. Their fastest vessels can travel between star systems in roughly 8 days. Their weapons technology is advanced but not unlimited. Their biggest weakness, she tapped the report, is that they have not fought a real war in over 200 years. The room was quiet. They're used to submission, she continued. Every species they've ever faced has given up. What? Their battle tactics are built on the assumption that the enemy will eventually stop fighting. Their command structures are centralized. Their communication systems are integrated, which means if you disrupt one part, the disruption travels. She paused. They think we're going to cry and hand over our keys. They're not prepared for what we're actually going to do. General Huang Wei, the head of Earth's combined ground forces, leaned forward. And what are we actually going to do? Oe looked at him calmly. We're going to use the 90 days they gave us outside the bunker. The world continued its noise, protests, prayers, debates, panic, but inside that gray room beneath the mountains, 41 people began a plan with a focus and a coldness that would have deeply unsettled High Arbiter Velkarath if he had been able to see it. In Earth's diplomatic team, a group of very talented and very patient people was given one job: talk, not to agree, not to submit, but to talk. Ask questions, request clarifications, express concerns, propose amendments, use every tool of bureaucratic delay that human civilization had developed over thousands of years of political negotiation. Every day they could buy was a day the Defense Command needed the Council's diplomatic liaison, a small green-skinned creature named Orth. Then it received the first message from Earth's team on the 4th day. It was polite, it was detailed. It asked 17 specific questions about the terms of the resource transfer, questions about measurement standards, delivery schedules, acceptable substitutions. Orth sighed. This happened sometimes with younger species. they asked questions. Because they did not understand, he sent back answers because that was his job. He did not realize that the questions were not about understanding, they were about time. Up in his observation chamber, Velkarath continued to watch. The planet below, he saw the protests. He saw the speeches, he saw the religious gatherings and the political arguments and all the very human things that humans did when they were frightened. He saw exactly what his analysts had told him he would see. Species in shock, struggling to come to terms with the inevitable. He did not see the submarines, the three of Earth's most advanced submarines had quietly left their ports in the first 48 hours after the ultimatum and were now positioned at coordinates that their commanders had memorized but never written down. They were not carrying traditional weapons. Their cargo was something that had been built in a facility that did not exist on any official record, equipment assembled from technology that humanity had spent 6 decades reverse engineering from. Debris crashed drones, action intercepted signals. He did not see the satellites, either not the new ones, to any scan. They looked like old communications infrastructure. They were not, and he did not see what was happening in the old iron mines of northern Canada, beneath a salt flat in Kazakhstan, and in a converted factory complex in the mountains of Chile, 3 locations that his analysts had surveyed and dismissed as economically inactive. None of it was economically inactive. Velkarath watched the blue planet and saw a frightened primitive world counting down its final days of independence. He watched humans argue on their screens and march in their streets and debate the terms of their own surrender, and he felt the mild, distant satisfaction of a man who already knew how the story ended. He had been doing this for a long time. The story always ended the same way. He had no reason to believe this time would be different. Below him, in the quiet deep of the planet's oceans and mountains and forgotten industrial spaces, humanity disagreed. The 90-day clock was ticking. Earth was not counting down, it was counting up. Admiral Yara Oe stood at the window of the bunker, a small rectangular window that looked out at nothing but rock, and she read the latest progress report from each of the 3 facilities. She folded it carefully. She set it down. She looked at the rock wall for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, and went back to work. There was a great deal still to do. The world did not know about Project 60. Most people on Earth had no idea that 63 years ago, a fishing boat off the coast of Norway had pulled something strange from the water, something metal and black and shaped like nothing any engineer on the planet had ever seen. The fishermen had reported it. The report had been quietly buried by government department that did not officially exist. The object had been moved to a facility in the Norwegian mountains, and from that day forward, very small and very secret group of scientists had been trying to understand what it was. It took them 9 years to figure out the power source. It took them another 12 to understand the propulsion system in the whole material. Took 22 years and 3 generations of metallurgists before they finally cracked the basic composition, a layered out that absorbed kinetic force and redistributed it across the entire surface, making it incredibly hard to damage with conventional weapons. They called it gray iron in the early notes, though the actual name that eventually ended up in classified files was Sarathi. Composite because by the time they understood it, and they had also decoded enough intercepted signals to know which civilization had built it, the Sarathi. Dominion, High Arbiter Velkaraths. People, this was the knowledge that the Council's analysts had missed entirely. They had studied Earth's official military programs, the jets, the missiles, the satellites, the naval vessels, all of that was real, and all of it was accounted for in their assessment. What they had not accounted for was the 60 years of quiet, patient, deeply classified research that had been running underneath all of it, research that had no budget lines in any public document, research that was funded through channels so carefully hidden that even most governments on Earth did not know it existed. Only 41 people knew the full picture. Admiral Yara Oe had been one of them for 6 years. On the 12th day after the ultimatum, she walked through the main hall of facility Kestrel, the largest of the 3 secret installations way buried beneath the old iron mines of northern Canada. The hall was enormous, carved directly from the rock, lit by long strips of white light that ran along the ceiling and filling the hall, standing in rows like enormous sleeping animals, were 12 warships. They did not look like anything humanity had built before. They were roughly wedge-shaped, smaller than the Sarathi vessels, but built with the same composite alloy on the outer hull. They had no visible gun ports, no missile tubes, nothing that looked like a traditional weapon. Instead, each ship carried an array of what the engineers called signal emitters, long, thin, antenna-like structures that ran along the spine of each vessel. These were the key to Oracle's reach. These were what would allow the system to touch the Council's ships from a distance. Oracle, offensive reaction, and command logic. Engine was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It did not fire, it did not explode. It thought. It was an artificial intelligence system that had been built over the last 9 years, specifically to analyze, model, and disrupt the command and communication architecture of Council warships. The Council ships, like most advanced Galactic technology, relied on a dense web of synchronized signals to coordinate everything: navigation, weapons, crew communication, even life support systems. All of it ran through central signal framework that the Council had been using for so long that it had never occurred to them to chain it. Why would they? No species they had ever encountered had been able to interfere with it. Oracle had been studying that framework for 4 years, fed by every intercepted transmission, every decoded signal, every scrap of data that Earth's hidden deep space listening arrays had collected. By the time the ultimatum arrived, Oracle had a complete map of the Council's signal architecture. It knew the frequencies. It knew the handshake protocols. It knew the timing patterns and the fallback channels and the emergency override sequences. It had not told anyone this. All at once, it had told Admiral Owen pieces, because pieces were easier to believe. She stood in the middle of the hall and looked at the 12 ships and thought about the 90 days. How many more can we finish? She asked, when the lead engineer, a tall Finnish woman named Dr. Sanna Machinen, walked beside her with a tablet. 7 more in Kestrel, 4 in Baikonur, 3 in Chile, 14 total before the deadline if we run the assembly teams in shifts around the clock. 26 total, Oy said. Yes, against roughly 400 Council ships. in near-Earth range if they decide to. Escalate. Oz nodded slowly. What's Oracle's assessment of those odds, Doctor? Mackinnon paused. Is more. Oracle doesn't think in terms of odds the same way we do. When I asked it to model the engagement, it said, she looked at her tablet, it said, quote, the number of ships is not the critical variable. The critical variable is the first 30 seconds. We looked at her. If we hit their command bridges, Dr. Metchin said, and we hit them all at once, their fleet coordination collapses. After that, each ship is acting independently, and individual ships without coordinated orders, when without synchronized targeting, without shared navigation, they become very manageable. She paused. Oracle gave that scenario a 71% probability of overall success, and the other 29%. We don't want to talk about the other 29%. He almost smiled. No, we don't. Meanwhile, in a conference room in Geneva, Earth's diplomatic team was on its 22nd consecutive hour of negotiations with Arath Van. The council liaison had begun showing signs of irritation, a faint darkening around his three eyes that the team had learned through careful observation indicated stress. He had answered 49 questions over the past 11 days. Earth's team had 40 more ready. The team lead was a former international trade lawyer named Constance Yaboa. She was 61 years old, wore the same gray blazer every day, and had a voice like still water, calm, flat, giving nothing away. She had been briefed on the defense plan in its broad strokes. She understood her role perfectly. Every question she asked was crafted to require a detailed answer. Every answer she received was met with a thoughtful pause and then a follow-up question. She was not stalling because she was afraid. She was stalling because somewhere underground people were building things and they needed time. Orth knew something was wrong on the 17th day. He couldn't say exactly what it was. It was a feeling, a professional instinct built from 20 years of council diplomatic work. These humans were too calm. Their questions were too structured. Young species in their position were usually desperate, emotional, disorganized. These people were organized. They were patient. Every time he felt the conversation moving toward a conclusion, they found a new thread to pull on. He sent a private message to Velkara's flagship. When there is something unusual about the human delegation, he wrote, I recommend a more thorough surface scan of the planet. Something feels wrong. Velkarath read the message, set it aside, and forgot about it within the hour. Oreth Vivin was overly cautious by nature. The analysts had been clear. Earth had no meaningful military capability. The scan showed nothing unusual. The planet was panicking. Everything was proceeding normally. He did not order the surface scan, and in the mountains of Chile, under a gray sky that smelled like rain, the third facility was running its assembly teams in 12-hour shifts. The workers, engineers, technicians, system specialists had been living in the facility for the past 3 weeks. They had been told what was at stake. They had been given a choice about whether to stay. Every single one of them had stayed. In the evenings during the 2-hour rest breaks, some of them sat outside on the flat concrete platform above the facility entrance and looked up at the stars. The sky from the Chilean mountains was extraordinarily clear. On a good night you could see the arm of the galaxy stretching overhead like a river of light. Somewhere out there, past the visible stars, the Galactic Council was waiting for Earth's answer. Inside the facility, a young technician named Riku Tanaka was running a diagnostic on one of the signal emitter arrays. He was 24 years old and had been recruited straight from his graduate program in electromagnetic systems engineering. He had been working on Oracle's hardware interface for 8 months without fully understanding what the project was for. 3 weeks ago he had been told. He had gone very quiet for about 10 minutes and then asked if he could call his mother. He had been told no for security reasons. He understood. He finished his diagnostic and marked the array green on his checklist and moved to the next one. There were 42 arrays on the ship alone. He had done 16 already. He worked steadily and without complaint because there was no time for anything else. On the 44th day, Admiral Ose received a report that made her set down her coffee very slowly and stare at the ceiling for a full minute. Oracle had run a new simulation overnight, its most detailed one yet, incorporating all the latest intelligence on the Council fleet positions. It had modeled 40,000 possible scenarios, varying the timing, the number of ships, the method of engagement, the Council's possible responses. Out of 40,000 scenarios, it had identified one approach that produced the best outcomes across the widest range of variables. The approach had one condition that no one on the Defense Command had considered. Earth had to strike first, not on the 90th day, when the deadline expired, not as a response to an attack before, one day before the deadline, while the Council was still expecting a diplomatic answer, while their ships were still sitting in their standard positions, while their crews were still running on peacetime schedules. Oracle's reasoning was precise. A preemptive strike on day 89 would catch the fleet in its most predictable configuration. A response strike after the Council attacked first would give them time to reorganize. Difference in success probability between the two approaches was not small. It was the difference between 71% and 34%. O read the report 3 times. Then she called the full Defense Command together and put the question to them. The room was quiet for a long time. Then, one by one, each of the 41 people in that gray bunker nodded. They had not come this far to be reasonable, and the 89th day began quietly. On the surface of Earth, people went about their mornings the way they had been going about every morning for the past 12 weeks, with low, constant anxiety, the kind that settles into the back of the chest and never fully goes away. Deadline was tomorrow. The Council was still up there, patient and immovable. Earth's diplomatic team had sent what the public was told was a final position. Paper protests had thinned. Churches were full. Most people had quietly, privately started to accept that there was going to be a governor, high arbiter. Velkarath had slept well. He woke at his usual hour, reviewed the overnight diplomatic transmissions. Nothing surprising. More clarifying questions from the human team about resource transfer protocols, and took his morning meal in the observation chamber. The planet below was mostly dark on this side, the Terminator line cutting across the Atlantic. Series city lights sparkled along the coast of North America. He noted with mild approval that the planet was still behaving itself. No unusual military movements, no dramatic last-minute posturing. The humans were going to submit quietly and By this time tomorrow, the paperwork would be signed and he could go home. He was still eating when Oracle woke up. There was no dramatic moment, no alarm, no visible signal. Oracle did not announce itself. It simply began a precise swarming coordinated cascade of electromagnetic pulses transmitted simultaneously from all 26 of Earth's newly constructed warships, from the 3 submarine arrays in the deep ocean, and from 14 repurposed satellites that had been drifting in positions chosen with extraordinary care over the previous 6 weeks. The pulses were tuned to the exact frequencies of the Council's integrated signal framework. They did not destroy anything. They did not burn out circuits or breach holes. Modernly, they did something much more elegant. They confused everything. The Council's 400 near-Earth ships suddenly had no idea where they were relative to each other. Navigation systems returned data that contradicted itself. Targeting computers lost their synchronized calibration. Communication between ships dropped to static. In an instant, a perfectly organized fleet became 400 individual vessels, each blinking and rebooting and trying to figure out what had just happened. Shortly, like a person waking up in a completely dark room, the whole process took 11 seconds. Velkar's breakfast tray hit the floor. Report, he said, and the word came out harder than he intended. His bridge crew was already at their stations. Screens were cycling. Officers were pressing controls and getting back error messages. One of his senior navigators, a young Sarathi named Felteriz, turned from her console with 3 eyes wide and said something that Velkarath would remember for the rest of his life. High Arbiter, we are blind. He crossed the chamber in 5 steps and looked at the navigation display. Himself, it was cycling through error codes, long strings of red characters that cascaded down the screen and refreshed and cascaded again without resolution. He tried the communication console, static. He tried the fleet command channel, more static, so he pressed the override. Nothing outside. The transparent floor, the blue planet, hung in space, looking exactly as it always did. Quiet round cloud, streaked and deceptively calm. Then the humans came, and the 26 Earth warships had been positioned in deep shadow behind the lunar mass, a placement that Oracle had calculated as the single location where they would be invisible to Council scans while still being within a 12-second approach window of the Council flagship and the 3 Sarathi warships stationed near Luna's orbit. As the signal cascade hit the fleet, all 26 ships fired their drives simultaneously. The approach was not elegant, it was not pretty either. It was fast and hard and committed the way humans throughout history had always charged when they decided to charge, with the absolute understanding that there was no turning back. So there was no point in going slowly on the bridge of Earth's lead ship, a vessel that had been named with very human practicality. Hull 1. Captain Dara 8 gripped the edge of her console and watched the distance counter drop. She was 40 years old, a former deep space mining pilot who had been recruited into the defense program 4 years ago, and she had the particular quality that Admiral O.C. looked for in all her captains. She did not freeze when things went wrong, and things always went wrong. She kept moving. 32, her navigator said. Drop pods ready, she asked. All 6 loaded and locked. On my mark. The drop pods were perhaps the strangest part of the entire plan, and that was saying something, given that the plan involved a planet of primates launching a surprise attack on a 17 civilization Galactic government. The pods were small, roughly coffin-sized, packed with 6 soldiers each. They had no traditional thrusters. Instead, they used a magnetic anchor system that Oracle had designed specifically for this operation, a way of attaching to the hull of a council ship from a distance and reeling in its speed like a harpoon. The system had been tested exactly twice, both times against decommissioned structures, and both times it had worked. There had been no time for a third test. The pods hit the hull of the first Sarathi warship near Luna at exactly the speed Oracle had calculated, hard enough to anchor, soft enough that the soldiers inside were shaken but functional. The hull access teams were through the outer plating in 40 seconds, and they had trained for this in a replica section of Sarathi hull that had been constructed in the Canadian facility from the original debris and 6 decades of engineering. Notes: the council crew inside did not know what to do. This was not dramatic incompetence. They were trained soldiers, and they reacted with professional speed, but they had been trained for enemies who fought in ways that made sense. Enemies who approached from a distance, who fired, who took cover, or who followed standard engagement patterns that the council's defensive protocols were built to handle. They were not trained for a scenario in which 6 small objects came out of nowhere, attached to the hull like parasites, and disgorge humans into their corridors at a dead sprint. The assault teams did not aim for engines. They did not aim for weapons or life support or any of the conventional strategic targets. They aimed for one thing: the command bridge. Oracle had been clear about this in its 40,000 simulations. The fastest and most decisive outcomes all came from the same action: remove command authority, and the ship stops functioning as a military asset, not because the crew gives up, but because every decision in a council warship flows from the command bridge. Weapons authorization, defensive counter measures, emergency protocols, all of it required a command officer's confirmation. Take the bridge and you take the ship, not by killing anyone, but simply by being physically present in the one room that made everything else possible. The first bridge was secured in 3 minutes and 52 seconds. Velkarath heard about it on a relay from the one emergency communication channel that Oracle had not fully blocked. Deliberate choice, because Oracle had calculated that Velkarath needed to see what was happening. Understanding had to proceed the next phase. He stared at the message and felt, and for the first time in his professional career, something that took him a full moment to identify. He was afraid, not because 3 of his ships were being boarded. That was bad. But it was manageable. He was afraid because of how it was being done. There was no rage in it, no desperation, no chaotic panic charge from a cornered species. What was happening to his fleet was organized, pre-planned, and surgically precise, and the signal disruption had clearly been designed and prepared over months. The drop pods were purpose-built for Council Hall specifications. The assault teams knew exactly where they were going inside ships they had never been on. These humans had been preparing for this. They had known this day was coming before the ultimatum was ever delivered. How long have they known? Felter asked quietly. From her console, Velkrath didn't answer because the answer forming. His mind was too large. On Hull 1, Captain Abai received confirmation that all 3 target ships near Luna had been secured. She allowed herself 1 second, exactly 1 second of something. That was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but lived somewhere between the two. Then she opened the fleet channel. All ships Oracle. Confirmed signal disruption. Holding. Across primary fleet. Move to secondary. Targets maintain approach vectors must. Do not deviate. 23 more Earth warships. Spread across a wide arc around the Council fleet's outer formation began their approach to the next set of targets. Oracle was updating their flight paths in real time, routing them around ships that had managed partial reboots, keeping them in blind spots that the signal disruption created and recreated as the Council systems tried to fight back. The Council systems were very good. They were recovering slowly, patchily, sections coming back online, and then dropping again as Oracle's emitters adjusted their output. It was a battle being fought not with weapons but with signals, and humanity had spent 4 years studying one side of it while the other side had no idea the fight was happening. Velkrath finally managed to get a partial communication line open to 3 of his nearest captains. He ordered them to engage the human ships directly. Full weapons, ignore the diplomatic implications. Whilst he used the word obliterate, his captains tried. They could not get a targeting lock. Every time their systems reached the point of lock acquisition, a pulse from one of the Earth vessel's emitters knocked the targeting calibration back to 0. Firing without a lock was possible, but at this range against targets that were actively maneuvering, it was useless. The Council ships fired anyway because they were given an order, and they followed orders. The shots went wide, it lighting up empty space, accomplishing nothing. A third of the Council fleet was now effectively taken out of the battle, either boarded, navigation blind, or firing uselessly at nothing. The remaining 2-3s were starting to recover. Velkrath could feel the situation stabilizing, feel the fog lifting, feel his fleet beginning to find itself again. The humans were outnumbered badly. If he could just get his ships coordinated, if he could just get them talking to each other again, he could end this. He opened the emergency fleet command channel and started issuing orders on Earth's defense command network. Oracle watched Velkrath's emergency channel online. It had been expecting this. It had planned for it to the second phase of the signal cascade held in reserve for exactly this moment, activated across all 26 Earthships and all 14 satellites simultaneously. The Council's emergency channel lasted for 4 seconds, then it went dark. Velkrath stood in his observation chamber, surrounded by his quietly panicking bridge crew, looking down at the planet that was supposed to have surrendered yesterday, and understood it with the particular cold clarity of a man who has just made a very serious miscalculation that the 90-day deadline had never been a deadline for Earth at all. It had been a countdown, and it had just reached 0. The news traveled faster than the Council had expected. That was partly because humanity had sent it within 6 hours of the counterattack beginning. Earth communication teams had assembled a clean, accurate, a fully documented record of every phase of the operation. The signal disruption, the boarding actions, the ship captures, the weapons lockouts and transmitted it on open frequencies into deep space, not to any specific address, just out in every direction, like dropping a stone in a still pond and watching the ring spread. The council had assumed that if anything ever went wrong with a submission operation, they could control the information. They had done it before. Managed the narrative, suppressed the details, kept their reputation for invincibility intact. What they had not accounted for was a species that had spent centuries developing communication technology and had a very old, deeply ingrained habit of telling everyone everything the moment something important happened. Humanity had not won. Yet the battle was still in progress. But it was already broadcasting. The first civilization to receive the transmission clearly was a smallet insectoid species called the Thun. 7 star systems, modest technology, no military to speak of, and a long history of paying council resource quotas on time because the consequences of not paying were things the Thun preferred not to think about. The Thun's receiving station picked up Earth's signal at the 43rd minute of the battle. The station operator, a 6-limbed creature named Velkos, who had worked the night shift alone for 11 years, listened to the transmission twice. Then Velkos sat very still for a long moment. Then Velkos transmitted it to every Thun station in the network. The Thun were not the only ones. The signal reached the Drev Collective, 12 Worlds Amphibian Species Council members, technically but resentful ones. Within 3 hours it reached the Pale Margin, a loose confederation of 4 species living in the Outer Rim who had been trying to negotiate better trade terms with the Council for 20 years. Without success, within 6 it reached deeper civilizations, older ones, stranger ones, over the following days, spreading outward in that unstoppable ring from the small blue planet that was not supposed to matter, and everywhere it landed, people stopped what they were doing and watched. The footage was remarkable, even to species that had no particular relationship with humanity. Planet that the Council had formerly rated Class 3 primitive had in a single day's operation disrupted the communications of 400 warships, simultaneously boarded 3 of the Council's most advanced vessels without losing a single soldier, and forced the flagship of the Galactic Council's high arbiter to stand down, not because Earth had more ships, not because Earth had better technology in any conventional sense, but because Earth had studied, prepared, thought, and then acted at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way. That was something that translated across species barriers without any need for interpretation. In the Drev Collective's parliament, a large or not acoustically perfect chamber where sound traveled in ways that amplified every speaker equally. The footage ran on a display behind the primary speaker's podium for 3 consecutive sessions. Representatives who had argued for years that the Council was too powerful to challenge sat and watched a Class 3 primitive planet disagree. The chamber was not loud, it was the opposite of loud. It was the silence of people rethinking very large assumptions deep in the Outer Rim. When in one of the Pale Margins trading stations, a group of species representatives had been in the middle of their quarterly frustration session, reviewing the latest Council trade demand, doing the numbers, confirming once again that they had no leverage and no options when the Earth signal arrived. One of the representatives, an elderly Tharvan merchant named Gossel, who had spent 40 years in trade negotiations, watched the footage and then asked everyone in the room to leave. He sat alone for a while, then he composed two messages. The first was to his own government, the second was to a frequency that Earth had included at the end of its transmission, a contact address, a small detail easily missed. A door left open. He was not the only one who noticed it. Back on Earth, Admiral O.C. received the first outer rim contact. On the 15th hour of the operation, she was in the middle of reviewing Oracle's latest fleet status report, and she had not slept in 31 hours. Her aide put the encrypted message in front of her, and she read it twice. Two of them, the aide said, "So far." O set the message down and rubbed her eyes. "Tell them we'll respond when we can. We're a little busy." The battle, if you could call it a battle in the traditional sense, had moved into a phase that Oracle called consolidation, and that the Earth crews privately called the chase. The 26 warships were no longer making dramatic assault approaches. They were moving methodically through the Council fleet, identifying which ships had fully rebooted their systems and were capable of organized resistance, and dealing with them before they could coordinate with each other. It was less like a fight and more like a farmer moving through field, steady, patient, covering every row. The Council ships that had regained navigation were facing a choice that their combat protocols were genuinely not designed for. They could engage the Earth vessels directly, but they targeting disruption was still active, and every attempt to fire had so far produced nothing useful. They could attempt to maneuver away, but Oracle was tracking every movement and rowing Earth ships to intercept, or they could do nothing and wait, which felt unacceptable but was in practical terms the safest option. Velkarath, on his partially blinded flagship, was issuing orders that his captains were struggling to follow. He was a good commander, experienced, decorated, respected with the Council hierarchy, and he was working as hard as he could with what he had, but what he had was a fleet that had been designed for a type of warfare that Earth was simply not playing. Every Council combat protocol assumed a certain set of behaviors from the enemy. The enemy was supposed to fire from range. The enemy was supposed to take defensive positions. The enemy was supposed to at some point recognize that they were outmatched and seek terms. Earth was not doing any of that. Earth was boarding ships. It kept boarding ships with those same small, fast pods that came out of nowhere and attached to holes like ticks and then disgorged. Those short, determined, absolutely relentless creatures who ran straight for the bridge and sat down in it and refused to leave. The Council's internal security teams were trained for many things. They were not trained for small groups of humans who fought with a combination of zero-gravity maneuver tactics and a personal intensity that bordered on unsettling. One Council security captain, a veteran named Thrisville, filed a report later, much later after everything was over, which he tried to describe what it had been like to face the boarding teams. He wrote, "They did not fight as though they were afraid of dying. They fought as though they were afraid of failing. There is a difference, and it is important, and I do not know how to model it in any of our systems." By the 18th hour, 14 Council warships had been boarded and secured. In another 62 were navigation blind and effectively Stationary, the remaining ships had formed a rough defensive cluster around Vel'Korath's flagship, close enough to each other that boarding approaches were difficult, and Oracle was calculating. With care, it was at this point that Vel'Korath did something that surprised his own crew. He opened a communication channel to Earth, not the diplomatic channel, not the formal council frequency. He opened a direct plane, unencrypted channel to whatever human command authority was on the other end. And he said in very plain words, "I want to speak with whoever is in charge." He waited 4 minutes, then Admiral Oi's voice came through. "High Arbiter," she said. She sounded tired but completely composed. "I imagine this is not the call you expected to be making today." Velcro was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "it is not. Are you calling to discuss terms?" Another pause. "And I am calling to understand," he said. "How long have you known?" Oe considered the question. "We've been watching your signals since before most of our current governments existed. We found debris from one of your ships 63 years ago. We've been studying it ever since." She paused. "You weren't paying close enough attention." The silence on the line was long. "What do you want?" he finally asked. And the words were simple, but the weight behind them was enormous, the weight of a man who had walked into a room expecting to negotiate from complete strength and found himself for the first time on the other side of the table. "We'll discuss that in person," Oe said. "Send your diplomatic team to Geneva. We'll meet in 48 hours. In the meantime, I'd appreciate it if your remaining ships stayed where they are." She didn't phrase it as a request exactly, but she didn't phrase it as a demand either. It sat somewhere in between, in that very particular register of someone who has already won and is now simply being polite about it. Vel'Korath ended the call. He stood in his observation chamber looking at the planet below. For a long time he said nothing. His crew said nothing either. The bridge was very quiet. Eventually, Felterra spoke. "High Arbiter," she would. "What do we do?" Velcro watched the slow white curves of clouds moving over the planet's southern oceans. He thought about the 14 submission operations he had overseen. He thought about the report he was going to have to file. He thought about the footage that was even now spreading through the galaxy at the speed of signal, the footage of his fleet, blind and boarded and stationary, orbiting a planet that had been on no one's list of concerns 2 days ago. "We wait," he said, and down on the surface of that small stubborn planet, in the council chambers of the outer civilizations, in the trading stations of the Rim, in the receiving rooms of a dozen species who had learned to keep their heads down and their mouths closed because the council was simply too powerful to challenge. The footage kept playing and people kept watching, and some of them, very quietly, started to feel something they had not felt in a very long time, something that tasted like the first breath of a very cold morning, something that tasted like hope. Nobody had ever walked into the Galactic Council's main chamber without an invitation. The chamber was on Sarathi Prime, the home world of the Sarathi Dominion, the most powerful civilization in the Council, and by extension the most powerful civilization in the known galaxy. Getting to Sarathi Prime required either a Council escort, a Council-issued travel permit, or a Council-authorized docking clearance. These were not things that were given easily. They were things that were applied for, reviewed, considered and either granted or denied, based on whether the council found you worth the trouble. Earth had not applied. Admiral Yara Oi arrived at Sarathi Prime on a vessel that was not registered in any council database, accompanied by a delegation of 12 people, and escorted by 6 of Earth warships, which had declined to remain outside the system and had instead parked themselves in a very deliberate and visible orbit around the planet's second moon when the Sarathi Port Authority challenged them on approach. Oi's communications officer had given a very polite response. We are here for the council session. We'll see you shortly. They had docked without permission. They had walked off their ship and into the spaceport without a council escort, and then without ceremony and without announcement and without waiting to be shown in, they had found the main chamber and walked through the doors. The Galactic Council was already in session. 17 delegations representing 17 civilizations occupying 17 curved desks, arranged in a great half-circle around a central speaking floor. The chamber was enormous, built on a scale that was meant to make visitors feel small. The ceiling was so high that the lighting near the top was dim, as though the room faded into its own sky. The acoustics were designed to carry every whisper to every seat. It was a room built to remind everyone who entered it that they were standing in the center of the most powerful governing body in the galaxy. The delegations went quiet when Oi walked in, not all at once. It was a ripple, like a wave of silence moving across the curved desks as one by one each delegation noticed the small group of humans crossing the speaking floor and heading without hesitation toward the central podium. No one stopped them. This was partly because no one was quite sure what the protocol was for this exact situation. Uninvited, unescorted, absolutely confident, and partly because everyone in the room had seen the footage. They knew who these people were. Oi reached the podium and set her notes down. She did not look nervous. She did not look triumphant. Thus, she looked like a person who had a number of important things to say and intended to say them clearly and without wasting anyone's time. She introduced herself. She introduced the delegation. She acknowledged briefly and without theatrics the events of the past 2 weeks, and then she began. The Galactic Council delivered an ultimatum to Earth 93 days ago, she said. Her voice was steady and carried perfectly in the designed acoustics. That ultimatum demanded submission and resource surrender and the dissolution of our right to self-governance. We are here today because we declined. She paused. We are here because we can be. There was movement among some of the delegations. Not alarm exactly, more like the particular stillness that falls over a room when people realize they are hearing something they will remember. We are not here to destroy the council, Oi continued. We are not here to replace it. We are here because the council, as it currently operates, is broken in ways that harm every civilization that exists under its authority, including eventually the ones with the most power. And we are here because we believe it can be fixed, and because we think we have earned the right to say so. She looked across the half-circle of delegations. She had spent 4 years helping plan a military operation. She had spent the week since then reading everything she could find about every member of this council, their histories, their grievances, their relationships with each other, their private resentments of the Sarathi's dominance, their quiet frustrations with the resource quota system, their long-standing but unspoken desire for something different. She had done her research. The proposals she was about to make were not improvised, they were precisely aimed. On the first proposal was the end of the resource colonialism doctrine, the policy that allowed the Council to designate any world below a certain development threshold as a resource extraction zone. Every species in the room below that threshold, and there were 9 of them, had been living under this policy for generations. She put the numbers on the chamber's main display, how much each civilization had surrendered, how little had been returned, how the gap had widened over 3 centuries, while no one disputed the numbers. Everyone already knew them. The second proposal was proportional representation in council governance. Currently, 7 species held over 80% of the council's voting power. 10 species, including several that had been council members for decades, had collectively less than 5%. The math was not complicated. It had never been complicated. It had simply never been addressed because the species with 80% of the votes had no interest in changing the numbers until now, when the species with no votes at all had just demonstrated with considerable force that power was not purely a function of council voting allocations. The third proposal was the dissolution of the pacification doctrine, the policy that allowed the council to use military force against any world that refused submission. Winnie spent the least time on this one. She did not argue it extensively. She simply noted that the policy had been attempted against Earth and had not worked, and that any doctrine whose primary value was deterrence had no value at all once its deterrence failed. She set out her proposals, and then she stopped talking. She stood at the podium and let the chamber sit with what had been said. The silence was the kind that comes not from shock but from calculation. 17 delegations, each running their own internal calculus, each measuring what they were hearing against what they wanted and what they feared. It was the head of the Drev collective delegation who spoke first. He rose from his seat and asked OE 3 precise questions about the representation proposal, detailed technical questions about implementation, transition periods, and enforcement mechanisms. She answered each one. He nodded and sat down. Then the Thune representative stood, and she was very small, and she stood for a long time without speaking, and when she did speak, her voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the chamber carried it perfectly. She said, "My civilization has been paying extraction quotas for 61 years. We have asked every decade for a review. We have been told every decade that the review would be scheduled. It has never been scheduled." She paused. "I support every proposal this delegation has made." Others followed, not all of them. The senior Sarathi delegation sat rigid and said nothing, their faces unreadable, clearly furious and clearly aware that fury was not going to change what was happening in this room. 2 other delegations with strong council ties were quiet, conservative, watching. But the others spoke, and the voices that came out were voices that had not spoken this freely in this room in a very long time. The session lasted 9 hours. When it was over and the council had not voted on anything, a formal vote required a process, committees, working groups, formal language, official submissions. What had happened instead was something older and more fundamental than any formal process, a shift in the room's center of gravity, a change in what was possible in 9 hours of open session. Proposals had moved from the category of unthinkable into the category of being openly discussed by everyone present including some who had more reasons than most to resist them. Velkarath attended the session. He had not been required to. He was present because he felt in some way he could not fully articulate that he owed it to himself to be there. He sat in the Sarathi delegation's curved desk and watched Oe speak and thought about everything he had missed. The 63 years of preparation, the patient questions at the negotiating table, the perfectly coordinated strike when the footage that had already changed the political landscape of the galaxy before a single formal proposal had been made. He thought about what he had said to the council before the operation, that Earth was a Class 3 primitive world with a 97.4% probability of peaceful submission. He thought about how that number had been constructed, what evidence it was based on, what assumptions the analysts had made, what they had looked for and what they had not bothered to look for. They had counted ships and weapons and technology thresholds. They had not counted years of quiet preparation. They had not counted the kind of species that build something in secret for 6 decades and says nothing. After the session, he found himself standing near Oe in the corridor outside the chamber. He had not planned to speak to her. He was not sure why he stopped. "You knew," he said, "when I delivered the ultimatum. You already knew what you were going to do." She looked at him since she was tired, the kind of tired that lives in the bones, not the face. "Yes," she said. "You let us believe you were afraid. We let you believe what you were prepared to believe." She said, "You looked at us and saw what you expected to see. We didn't change what we were. We just didn't correct your impression." He thought about that for a moment. It was well done, he said finally. The words cost him something, but he said them anyway because they were true. "Thank you," she said. "Then for what it's worth, we don't want enemies. We never did. We just want to be left alone to be what we are." She walked back toward where her delegation was waiting. 3 weeks later, the formal working group on council reform held its first session. 14 delegations sent representatives. It was the largest such group in council history. The agenda was long and the work was hard, and it would take years. Nobody expected it to be simple, but it was happening. In the pale margin are in the Thune home system, in the trading stations of the outer rim, and the quiet, careful conversations of 100 worlds that had spent generations learning to want less so the loss would hurt less. The footage of the 93 days played on pass from screen to screen, translated into dozens of languages, retold in forms that fit each culture that received it, not as a story about war, not really, as a story about what happens when a species decides it is done, being told what it is worth. Admiral Oe sat in the back of the shuttle returning to Earth and watched the stars through the small porthole. She was asleep within 4 minutes. She dreamed of nothing. It was the best sleep she had gotten in years. Below her, growing slowly larger as they descended, was the planet, blue and white and still impossibly beautiful, looking exactly as it always had from orbit, a small and fragile and absolutely immovable. The work was not finished. It had barely started. There were proposals to negotiate, reforms to Fight for alliances to build carefully. And a galaxy that would need a great deal of time before it truly understood what had changed, but the door was open, and Earth had walked through it on its own terms in its own time without asking permission from anyone, the way it had always done everything that mattered.